33 years ago, on June 3, 1989, the largest railroad accident in the history of the Soviet Union occurred. On the Asha Ulu-Telyak section, near Ufa, during the oncoming passage of two passenger trains number 211 Novosibirsk Adler and number 212 Adler Novosibirsk, a huge explosion occurred. As it turned out later, the explosion was the result of an accident on the Siberia-Ural-Volga pipeline, running along the railroad bed. As a result of the accident, 575 people were killed, including 181 children. More than 600 people got wounds and injuries of varying degrees of severity. The force of the explosion can be judged by the fact that the explosion knocked out windows in houses in the town of Asha, located 10 kilometers from the site of the accident. The explosion damaged 37 carriages and 2 electric locomotives. 26 carriages were completely burnt out, 7 carriages were damaged so that it was impossible to repair them and they were excluded from the inventory. Explosion on an oil pipeline. The West Siberia-Ural-Volga pipeline, where the accident that led to the tragedy took place, was built relatively recently. Its construction began in 1981 by order of the USSR Council of Ministers. Initially it was built as an oil pipeline, but then the USSR Ministry of Oil Industry decided to convert the facility into a product pipeline. Accordingly, changes were made to convert the pipeline to transport liquefied gas. Although regulations prohibited transportation of pressurized liquefied gas through pipelines over 400 millimeters in diameter, and the diameter of this pipeline was 720 millimeters, this requirement was ignored. In 14 places, the pipeline crossed railroad tracks. Among the railway lines to be crossed was the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was characterized by high freight traffic. Along 273 kilometers, the pipeline was very close to the railroads, closer than 1 kilometer, and also went dangerously close to populated areas, the towns of Minyar, Usd Katev, Zlatidust, the village Kropachevo. On June 4, 1989 at 1:15 local time, June 3, 1989 at 23:15 Moscow time, at the moment when two passenger trains following the Transsib passed each other, there was a powerful gas explosion and the strongest fire broke out. The gas mixture could have exploded from an accidental spark from a cigarette but thrown out of the window of the train. There were 1284 passengers and 86 locomotive and train crew members in the train number 211 Novosibirsk Adler, 20 wagons, locomotive BL 10-901, and number 212 Adler, Novosibirsk, 18 wagons, locomotive CS 2-689. Such a big number of passengers was explained by the fact that both trains were resort trains, consisting of families with children going to or coming from resorts, as well as children going to pioneer camps on the Black Sea coast of Caucasus. By the way, the large number of children on the trains was one of the main reasons for the discrepancy in the number of deaths. It is possible that there were more than a few dozen people than was officially reported, since small children were often not ticketed, and many people preferred to go for a small bribe in the conductor's compartment, without buying tickets at the cashier's office as well. As a result of the explosion, 11 carriages were thrown off the railroad tracks, 7 of them completely burnt out. Another 27 cars were burned from the outside and burnt out inside. There were 575 people killed in the catastrophe. Among them were 9 hockey players of the Tractor's 73 team. 623 people became disabled as a result of severe injuries and burns. How the explosion occurred. It was found that a narrow slit of about 1.7 meters had formed in the West Siberia-Ural-Volga pipeline. Due to a leak in the pipeline, gas had accumulated in a depression through which the railroad ran. The Trans-Siberian Railway was 900 meters away from the pipeline. The catastrophe happened just 3 hours before the instruments showed a pressure drop in the pipeline. However, the people on duty did not look for a leak, but increased the amount of gas supplied in order to restore the pressure. As a result of the increased gas supply, large quantities of propane and butane leaked out through the resulting gap and formed a gas lake in the lowland where the railroad ran. Although just before the accident the drivers of the trains passing along the main line had warned the dispatcher service about the strong gassiness of the section, the railway authorities also did not take this fact seriously and did not take any measures to temporarily stop the movement of trains through this section. According to the official version, the main reason for the gas leak may have been mechanical damage to the pipeline caused by an excavator bucket during construction work in October 1985, for years before the explosion. However, the actual gas leak began 40 minutes before the explosion. Another version suggests that the accident could have been the result of the corrosive effect of electric leakage currents on the outside of the pipe. Approximately 2 to 3 weeks before the accident, a hole had formed in the pipeline, which began to grow in length as the gas expanded, due to the cooling of the pipe. A crack was formed. The soil at the depth of the trench began to soak up liquid condensate, after which it descended toward the railroad. When the two trains met and braked, a spark could have occurred, causing a gas explosion. The reaction of the Soviet leadership. On June 4, 1989, the next day after the accident, representatives of the highest leadership of the Communist Party in the Soviet state arrived on the scene. Mikhail Gorbachev, General Secretary of Central Committee of USSR Communist Party and Chairman of Supreme Soviet of USSR. Members of the Governmental Commission for Investigation of the Circumstances of the Accident, chaired by Gennady G. Vodernikov, Deputy Chairman of the USSR Council of Ministers, former First Secretary of the Chelyabinsk Regional Committee of the CPSU and, before that, First Secretary of the Chelyabinsk City Committee of the CPSU, who knew the region and its problems well, also arrived. On June 5, 1989, a one-day mourning period was declared in memory of those killed in the Ufa bombing. The trial over the Ufa bombing lasted 6 years and ended in the Russian Federation after the Soviet state ceased to exist. The charges were brought against 9 officials, the head of the Nefteprovodmontaj construction and installation department, workers and site managers. But they were not given any serious terms of imprisonment. In fact, no one was actually punished for the deaths of 575 people. Moreover, the court avoided mentioning high-ranking executives of the Soviet oil and gas industry, although the investigators were interested in their role in the negligent treatment of the pipeline. The shooters responded, the sentences were lenient. As the expert notes, the criminal code of the RSFSR of that time contained several articles stipulating responsibility for violation of safety rules during certain types of works. Thus, for example, Article 215 of the Criminal Code of the RSFSR stipulated responsibility for violation of safety rules during construction works if it caused harm to people. And this article provided for very mild penalties under Part 1, up to 1 year in prison, and under Part 2, up to 5 years in prison. Part 2 was incriminated if there were human casualties. As for who could be blamed for such accidents, as a rule, the accused were ordinary employees, workers, foremen, site supervisors, and railway employees. Though the causes could have been systematic, but it was always easier to find a switchman who would serve 2 years, and the question would be over, the guilty ones would get what they deserved. Were there any compensations for the victims? Did they get them? In the Soviet Union, the situation with compensation was worse than now. On the other hand, the authorities did pay a burial grant of 800 rubles, which was very good money by Soviet standards, at 1989 prices. Another thing is that there were numerous abuses in the calculation of these subsidies. For example, there are known cases when especially enterprising people received the subsidies twice each. But, of course, there was no talk then about such compensations which would be paid today. Who was found guilty and what penalties were imposed? As I have already noted above, ordinary people were found guilty, middle-ranking technicians. However, the terms to which they were sentenced were not serious. First, Ramil Urazin, chief engineer of PMK-1, and Fanis Kashapov, foreman of PMK-1, were found guilty. They were convicted under Article 215 Part 2 of the Criminal Code of the RSFSR and were sentenced to 2 years imprisonment with a deferred sentence of 1 year, after which they were released from responsibility under an amnesty. Second, the guilty party was found the chief of the site of SMU-1 Igor Kalachev. He received exactly the same punishment and was also released under an amnesty. Viktor Kirikin, head of the construction department of the Trust Nefteprovodmontaj, and Alexander Kurbatov, head of the linear engineering and technological service of Almatyevsk Department of Trunk Pipelines and the Minibevsk gas processing plant, received the actual sentences. They were convicted under two articles: Article 215, Paragraph 2 of the RSFSR Criminal Code and Article 172 of the RSFSR Criminal Code for negligence. Both Kurbatov and Kurakin were sentenced to 2 years in a penal colony. Finally, Alexander Makarov, the shift supervisor of the Line Technological Service, got 2 years suspended sentence under Article 215, Part 2, and was also amnestied. Thus, all persons found involved in the disaster, which took the lives of several dozen Soviet citizens, in fact, got off with a light scare. The higher-ups, covering themselves, did their best not to cause a scandal about this terrible catastrophe. Of course, such verdicts can hardly be called fair, and it is doubly unfair that no one of the higher-ranking executives was harmed. Consequences of the terrible catastrophe. Rescue operations had been going on for days at the scene of the terrible disaster. Some of their members are still working in the ambulance service. Resuscitator Yuri Furtsev recalled, "There was no road, and the rescuers made their way to the epicenter of the explosion on foot. When they arrived, they saw the wagons overturned, the wood burned and people burnt." The accident itself, which took the lives of 575 people, and that is only according to official data, was one of the biggest tragic events in the history of Perestroika-era USSR. It was, however, soon wiped out by subsequent no less horrible events, only not of technogenic but of political and military nature. In 1990 to 1991, the centrifugal tendencies in the national republics intensified, and a de facto dual power system was formed, in which President Boris Yeltsin competed for power with Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. At the end of 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and the post-Soviet republics were plunged into the darkness of economic crises, civil wars, and political chaos. In this situation, no one cared about the railway accident, and only relatives and a few eyewitnesses and participants in the elimination of the consequences of the terrible tragedy were left to mourn the hundreds of deaths. Subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends. Give it a thumbs up. Tell us interesting facts you know about the topic of this video. See you in new videos.